The red carpet shimmered under the golden lights as luxury cars pulled up one by one. Guests in designer gowns and tailored suits mingled, their laughter and chatter filling the air outside one of the city's most exclusive events. It was the kind of night where everyone who mattered was present, or so they thought. Among the arrivals was Dr. James Carter, a world-renowned surgeon who had revolutionized treatment methods in his field. But as he approached the entrance, dressed in an understated suit, there was no warm welcome, no recognition. Instead, he was met with skepticism and subtle disdain. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" the doorman asked, his tone sharp, his eyes scanning James like he didn't belong. Guests glanced over, curiosity turning to judgment. The assumptions were instant, the dismissals unspoken yet painfully clear. But James wasn't the kind of man to let ignorance rattle him. What neither the staff nor the onlookers knew was that they were about to make a mistake so monumental it would become the talk of the night. What happens next will leave you questioning how we define success and who truly belongs. Keep watching to see the moment that turned this night upside down. The evening was electric, the kind of night that made headlines the next morning. The city's elite had gathered for the annual charity gala, a celebration of wealth, influence, and goodwill. Held at the luxurious Sapphire Hall, an architectural masterpiece adorned with crystal chandeliers and velvet drapes, the event was invitation only, a symbol of exclusivity and prestige. Guests arrived in their finest attire, stepping out of luxury cars to the flashes of photographers eager to capture their every move. The air buzzed with anticipation as conversations intertwined with the soft melodies of a string quartet playing in the background. Waiters glided across the room, carrying trays of champagne flutes, the bubbles sparkling as brightly as the diamonds on the attendees. This was a place for connections, for power plays cloaked in polite smiles, and for showcasing success. As the grand hall filled, it became clear that this was more than a gala. It was a statement. Being seen here wasn't just a privilege. It was a declaration of belonging to a world where status and image reigned supreme. Names were dropped, deals hinted at, and the scent of exclusivity lingered in the air. Outside the venue, a line of guests checked in at the entrance, greeted with deference by the impeccably dressed staff. Names were verified on the list, and invitations were scrutinized with care. The staff had one job: to ensure that only the right people gained entry. It was a smooth operation, until a man arrived who disrupted their assumptions. Dr. James Carter approached the entrance with a quiet confidence. He wasn't flashy, nor did he arrive with an entourage. But his calm demeanor carried a weight that went unnoticed by the staff, who saw only what they expected to see. For them, his presence was an anomaly, and what happened next would expose the very fabric of the event's exclusivity. Dr. James Carter was no ordinary man. Born and raised in a working-class neighborhood, he had overcome adversity at every turn. His journey to success had been paved with determination, brilliance, and an unwavering belief in the power of education. As a child, James excelled in school, fueled by a desire to make a difference. His dream of becoming a doctor wasn't just about ambition. It was a mission to heal and uplift those often overlooked by the system. Through tireless work and countless sacrifices, James earned a full scholarship to one of the nation's most prestigious medical schools. He quickly rose to prominence in the medical field, not just for his groundbreaking research, but for his compassionate approach to patient care. Over the years, his reputation had grown internationally. He wasn't just a doctor. He was a pioneer, a mentor, and an advocate for equality in healthcare. Yet, for all his accomplishments, James remained humble. He had no interest in flaunting his success. Instead, he let his work speak for itself. Tonight, he attended the charity gala, not as a guest seeking attention, but as someone committed to supporting its noble cause. His presence alone could have drawn significant contributions, but that wasn't why he came. As he walked toward the entrance of Sapphire Hall, His thoughts weren't on the glitz and glamour of the event, but on the lives that could be changed by the funds raised. He had spent his life breaking barriers, but he didn't expect to face one tonight. Dressed in a tailored yet understated suit, James was a stark contrast to the ostentatious displays around him. He was used to being judged by his appearance, but he thought that at an event celebrating charity and humanity, those prejudices would take a back seat. He was wrong. As he reached the entrance, the first barrier wasn't the velvet rope. It was the assumptions waiting on the other side. As Dr. James Carter approached the grand entrance of Sapphire Hall, the opulence of the evening was on full display. The line of guests in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos moved seamlessly through the check-in process, each name met with smiles and respectful nods. But when James stepped forward, the smooth operation ground to an abrupt halt. The doorman, a tall man with an air of self-importance, looked James up and down with a raised eyebrow. His tailored suit, while impeccable, lacked the flashy embellishments of the evening's usual attendees. Without even glancing at James's invitation, the doorman's expression hardened. "Excuse me, sir," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" James, unfazed by the man's tone, offered a polite smile. "Yes, I'm here for the charity gala." The doorman's eyes narrowed, and he folded his arms. "This is a private event, sir. Invitation only." James calmly reached into his jacket and pulled out the embossed invitation, handing it over without a word. The doorman snatched it, inspecting it with exaggerated scrutiny, as if expecting it to be a fake. Behind him, other staff members began to notice the exchange, their curious glances quickly turning into whispered commentary. The doorman finally said, his tone still skeptical. "I'll need to verify this. Wait here." James stood patiently, his demeanor calm, but the murmurs from nearby guests began to ripple through the line. "Who is he?" one whispered. "Doesn't look like he belongs," said another, their judgment thinly veiled. Minutes passed, and the doorman returned, holding the invitation as if it might contaminate him. "We can't verify your name on the list," he announced loudly, his voice carrying enough to draw attention. "I'm afraid you'll have to leave." By now, the crowd had grown intrigued, their eyes darting between James and the doorman. James tilted his head slightly, his polite smile unwavering. "Perhaps there's been a mistake," he said evenly. "Would you like to check again?" The doorman's lips curled into a smirk. "No mistake," he said, his voice laced with arrogance. "And if you don't leave, we'll have security escort you out." The audacity of the moment hung thick in the air, the blatant disrespect palpable. Guests murmured in shock, while James remained poised. The assumptions, the arrogance, the thinly veiled racism, it was all so familiar. But James wasn't done yet. What happened next would shatter every assumption they had made about him. The murmurs among the crowd grew louder as the doorman's voice rose, his words laced with smug authority. "I've already told you, sir, this event is exclusive. You're not on the list, and we cannot allow you entry." His tone wasn't just firm. It was pointed, deliberate, meant to make a spectacle of the moment. Dr. James Carter stood still, his expression calm, but his eyes flickering with the weight of the moment. The air around him seemed to thicken as the bystanders leaned in, some whispering, others openly gawking. Dressed in their opulent attire, their eyes held judgment thinly disguised as curiosity. "Maybe he's just lost," someone muttered from the sidelines, loud enough for James to hear. "Or looking for handouts," another chuckled, their laughter carrying a sharp edge. James's silence seemed to irritate the doorman further. "Look," the man continued, holding up the now creased invitation like a piece of evidence in a courtroom. "This clearly doesn't belong to you. Did you find this in the parking lot or something?" The crowd gasped softly, a mix of shock and perverse amusement. James's jaw tightened, but his composed demeanor didn't waver. Around him, the ripple of disdain began to grow. Some whispered about his audacity to show up uninvited, while others speculated about his real purpose for being there. "You should have known better," the doorman sneered, leaning closer. "This isn't the kind of place where people like you just stroll in." The words hit harder than any physical blow. The implicit meaning, the sheer arrogance. It was a reminder of the biases James had faced his entire life. And yet, he stood tall, his silence louder than the accusations hurled his way. A woman in an extravagant gown approached, her diamond necklace catching the light as she surveyed the scene. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her voice tinged with feigned concern. "Not at all," the doorman replied quickly, flashing her a reassuring smile. "Just handling a misunderstanding." The woman glanced at James, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Maybe he's a caterer," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "Someone should escort him to the service entrance." The humiliation was deliberate, calculated to strip him of dignity. The assumptions, the public spectacle, it was all designed to send one clear message: you don't belong here. But what they didn't know was that the man they sought to demean had a truth that would shatter their pretenses. James took a deep breath. The moment to reveal it was approaching, and it would change everything. As the crowd's whispers swelled and the doorman's smirk deepened, James remained composed, his silence a stark contrast to the chaos around him. But just as the tension reached its peak, a voice cut through the commotion, strong, authoritative, and filled with disbelief. "What's going on here?" The crowd parted slightly as a tall, elegantly dressed man stepped forward. His silver hair and commanding presence exuded respect, and his tone carried the weight of someone used to being listened to. It was Mr. Langston, the event's primary sponsor and a renowned philanthropist. His gaze swept over the scene, landing on the doorman, who suddenly seemed less sure of himself. "Sir," the doorman began, his arrogance faltering, "this man showed up with what I believe is a fake invitation. He's not on the list, and I was just about to have him escorted out." Langston's eyes narrowed as he turned to James, his brow furrowing. "Is that so?" he said, his voice quieter but no less powerful. "And did it occur to you to check your assumptions before creating a scene?" The doorman's confidence crumbled further. "Well, I mean, look at him," he stammered, gesturing weakly toward James. "He doesn't what?" Langston snapped, cutting him off. "Belong here? You don't even realize who you're speaking to, do you?" The crowd fell silent, their curiosity now tinged with unease. Langston stepped closer to James, extending a hand with a warm smile. "Dr. Carter," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "it's an honor to have you here tonight." A gasp rippled through the onlookers. The realization hit like a tidal wave. Dr. James Carter? The James Carter. The whispers turned to murmurs of disbelief as they pieced together the truth. This wasn't just any man. They were in the presence of one of the most accomplished and respected figures in medicine. The doorman's face turned ashen. "Dr. Carter?" he croaked, his voice barely audible. James finally spoke, his tone calm yet powerful. "Yes, I'm Dr. James Carter, and I was invited to this event to support its cause, just like everyone else." Langston turned back to the staff, his expression cold. "You owe this man an apology, now." The doorman stumbled over his words, but the damage was done. The truth was out, and the crowd, now silenced by shame and awe, watched as Dr. Carter stood tall, his dignity unshaken. In that moment, he wasn't just a guest. He was a symbol of resilience, grace, and the power of truth. The weight of Langston's words hung in the air, silencing the crowd. "Dr. James Carter," he repeated, turning to face the onlookers with a firm, measured gaze. "One of the most brilliant medical minds of our generation, a man whose work has saved countless lives and revolutionized healthcare worldwide. And yet, he's standing here, being treated like he doesn't belong." The room was frozen in place, every face reflecting a mix of shock, disbelief, and, for some, shame. The doorman, now pale and trembling, took a step back, clutching the crumpled invitation as if it might absolve him. I didn't know," he stammered, his bravado replaced with a feeble attempt at an excuse. James raised a hand, his calm voice cutting through the awkwardness. "No, you didn't know," he said, his tone steady but unyielding. "And that's the problem." Langston nodded in agreement and stepped aside, allowing James to address the gathered guests directly. His eyes swept over the sea of expensive gowns and tailored suits, meeting each gaze with quiet authority. He wasn't angry, he was disappointed, and the weight of his presence made that disappointment even more profound. "I'm not here to make anyone uncomfortable," James began, his voice carrying across the hall with practiced ease. "I came to this event because I believe in its mission, to raise funds for those in need, to provide opportunities for people who don't have them. But tonight, I'm reminded that sometimes the biggest barriers people face aren't financial. They're the assumptions we make about them before they even speak." The crowd shifted uncomfortably, some guests glancing down at their feet, others looking toward James with newfound respect. "You see," he continued, "I wasn't always Dr. James Carter. I grew up in a neighborhood where opportunities were few and far between. My family struggled to make ends meet, and the only thing I had was a belief that education could change my life. It did, but not without obstacles. Obstacles like the ones I face tonight." He turned toward the doorman, his expression softening slightly. "I've faced moments like this my entire life, being judged by the color of my skin, by what people think I should or shouldn't be. It's exhausting, but it's also an opportunity to educate, to challenge perceptions, and to remind people of what truly matters." Langston clapped a hand on James's shoulder, his voice breaking the momentary silence. "And remind us you have, Dr. Carter. Your presence here is more valuable than any check written tonight." A smattering of applause began, hesitant at first, but quickly swelling into a wave of clapping and cheers. The crowd, now fully aware of their misjudgment, erupted into a standing ovation. Even those who had whispered cruel remarks earlier joined in, their faces red with regret. The doorman stepped forward, his head bowed. "Dr. Carter, I'm deeply sorry for how I treated you," he said, his voice cracking. "I was wrong." James nodded, accepting the apology with grace. "It's not just about me," he said. "It's about how we treat each other every single day. Assumptions like these don't just hurt individuals, they hurt all of us." As the applause continued, James stepped through the grand doors, finally welcomed into the event. But he hadn't just gained entry to a gala. He had opened minds, changed perspectives, and reminded everyone present of the power of respect and humanity. That night, the exclusive charity gala became about more than money or status. It became a moment of transformation, led by a man who refused to be defined by prejudice and instead chose to inspire change. As the applause subsided and Dr. James Carter stepped inside the grand venue, a heavy sense of reflection swept over the room. The dazzling chandeliers and opulent decor now felt starkly at odds with the raw reality that had just unfolded outside. Guests whispered amongst themselves, their faces tinged with embarrassment, guilt, or a newfound sense of awareness. The doorman stood by the entrance, his confidence shattered. He avoided eye contact with everyone, especially James, who had shown far more dignity and grace than the situation warranted. The event organizers, alerted to the incident by Mr. Langston, rushed to address the damage. A woman in a sleek black dress, the head coordinator of the gala, approached James with a nervous smile. "Dr. Carter," she began hesitantly, "on behalf of the entire event staff, I want to extend our sincerest apologies. This should never have happened, and I assure you, steps will be taken to prevent such behavior in the future." James turned to her, his expression calm but firm. "I appreciate the apology, he said. But this isn't just about me. This is about the mindset that allowed it to happen in the first place. If I weren't Dr. James Carter, if I were someone without the titles or recognition, would anyone have stood up for me? Would I have been treated as human first? Her face flushed, and she nodded solemnly. You're absolutely right. This incident has highlighted issues we cannot ignore. I'll ensure it's addressed immediately. Meanwhile, Mr. Langston, who had remained by James's side, turned to the crowd, his voice booming with authority. This event is supposed to celebrate unity, charity, and humanity, he said. But tonight, we were all reminded of how easily those values can be overshadowed by bias. What happened outside should never have occurred. It's a stark reminder that even in circles of privilege, ignorance and prejudice can thrive. The crowd, still visibly unsettled, listened in silence, many nodding in agreement. Langston continued, We need to ask ourselves how often we judge others unfairly, how often we let appearances cloud our judgment, and more importantly, how often we stand by silently when we see it happening. James added, Change doesn't come from moments like this alone. It comes from what happens after. If this evening inspires even one of you to challenge your assumptions, to treat someone with more respect and empathy tomorrow, then perhaps this experience wasn't in vain. The weight of his words lingered, and many in the room seemed visibly moved. The guests weren't the only ones reflecting. The staff, especially the doorman, were also grappling with their actions. The doorman, unable to contain his remorse, approached James once more. Dr. Carter, he said, his voice trembling. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want to say, I'm sorry, truly sorry. James looked at him, his expression unreadable. After a pause, he said, Acknowledging your mistake is the first step. What matters now is how you choose to move forward. The consequences of bias were laid bare for all to see that night. It wasn't just about one man being denied entry. It was about the countless invisible walls built by prejudice. James's calm yet powerful response had turned an ugly moment into a lesson, a chance for redemption, and a call to action. From that point on, the event shifted. The usual small talk and networking gave way to deeper conversations about inclusion and fairness. What began as a night of exclusivity transformed into a moment of introspection, a reckoning with the biases that had gone unchecked for too long. By the time the evening ended, it was clear. The ripple effects of that encounter would extend far beyond the glittering walls of Sapphire Hall. As the room settled and the weight of the evening's events lingered in the air, Dr. James Carter found himself standing at the center of attention. This wasn't the kind of spotlight he sought, but he knew it was an opportunity, a chance to turn an ugly incident into a moment of transformation. The murmurs in the grand hall faded as James stepped forward, his presence commanding yet humble. Guests turned their gazes toward him, their curiosity and guilt mingling in their expressions. He didn't have to say anything to command respect, but when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of truth and experience. I didn't come here tonight expecting a grand welcome, James began, his tone calm but resonant. I came to support a cause that I believe in deeply, a cause rooted in helping others, in bridging gaps and building connections. But what I experienced at the door was a reminder of how far we still have to go. His words landed heavily, and the room fell silent. Prejudice isn't always loud, he continued. Sometimes it whispers in the assumptions we make. It hides in the way we treat people based on how they look, what they wear, or what we think they can afford. Tonight, I wasn't judged for who I am, but for who I appeared to be. James paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the audience. I want you all to think about something, he said, his eyes scanning the crowd. What would have happened if I weren't Dr. James Carter? If I were simply a man trying to do something good without the accolades or the title? Would anyone have stood up for me? Would my presence have been valued the same way? A few heads lowered in shame. Others nodded in agreement. James's tone softened, but his resolve remained firm. This isn't about one person or one moment. It's about a culture, one that we have the power to change. It starts with challenging our assumptions, with seeing people for who they are, not who we think they should be. The audience remained riveted as James concluded, his voice steady but filled with emotion. This gala is about charity, about helping those in need. Let's not forget that the greatest charity begins with how we treat the person standing right in front of us. The room erupted into applause, not the polite kind often heard at events like this, but genuine, heartfelt applause. James had taken a moment of humiliation and turned it into a powerful lesson, leaving everyone with a new understanding of their own biases. He stepped back, his job done, knowing his words would resonate far beyond the glittering walls of Sapphire Hall. As the applause echoed throughout the hall, Dr. James Carter stepped back, allowing his powerful words to sink in. The guests, who had arrived expecting a night of luxury and networking, were now grappling with emotions they hadn't anticipated. Shame, reflection, and a glimmer of hope hung in the air, like an unspoken agreement to do better. Among those most affected was the doorman, who still lingered near the entrance, his face pale and his posture stiff with regret. He had been the catalyst for the evening's tension, and now, under the weight of his actions, he struggled to find a way forward. Slowly, he approached James, the man he had dismissed so carelessly just hours earlier. "Dr. Carter," he began, his voice shaky but sincere. "I don't know where to start. What I said, what I assumed about you, it was wrong, completely wrong. I can't express how sorry I am." James turned to face him, his expression calm and measured. He could see the sincerity in the man's eyes, the vulnerability of someone who had been forced to confront their own biases. "Acknowledging your mistake is a start," James said softly. "But true change comes from action. Ask yourself why you made those assumptions and what you can do to ensure it doesn't happen again, not just to me, but to anyone." The doorman nodded, tears brimming in his eyes. "I will, sir. I promise." Nearby, Mr. Langston observed the exchange, his face thoughtful. He stepped forward, addressing the doorman. "We all make mistakes," Langston said, "but tonight is a reminder of the harm they can cause. Use this moment to grow, to learn, and to become better." The doorman nodded again, his gaze fixed downward. Meanwhile, the crowd began to break into smaller groups, conversations buzzing with reflection. For the first time, the gala felt less like an exclusive event and more like a space for change. Guests whispered about their own biases, sharing stories of times they might have judged someone unfairly. James retreated to a quieter corner of the room, taking a moment to breathe. Sarah Langston, Mr. Langston's wife, approached him with a warm smile. "You've given everyone here something to think about, Dr. Carter," she said. "Tonight wasn't just about raising money. It became about raising awareness, thanks to you." James nodded, gratitude flickering in his eyes. If even one person here walks away with a new perspective, it was worth it. The night wasn't perfect, but it had become something greater, a moment of redemption for some and of reflection for many. James knew that the lessons learned here would ripple far beyond the glittering walls of Sapphire Hall, sparking change in ways he might never see. But that, he realized, was the true power of moments like this. As the gala wound down, the once vibrant hum of conversation mellowed into a quieter, more introspective energy. Guests lingered longer than usual, not to network, but to reflect. Dr. James Carter had not only challenged their assumptions, but left them with a profound lesson about the power of grace and the urgency of change. James stood near the exit, preparing to leave, when Mr. Langston approached him once more. "Dr. Carter," he said, extending his hand, "I can't thank you enough for what you've done tonight. This event was meant to support others, but I think you've given us something far greater, a mirror to examine ourselves." James smiled, shaking Langston's hand firmly. "We all have moments when we can do better," he replied. "It's what we choose to do after those moments that matters." As James turned to leave, the doorman hesitated by the door. His face was still flushed with embarrassment, but this time he met James's gaze directly. "Thank you, Dr. Carter," he said, his voice earnest, "for your patience and your kindness. I'll carry this lesson with me." James nodded, his response simple yet profound. "Treat people with respect, and you'll never regret it." Walking out of the grand hall and into the crisp night air, James felt an unexpected sense of peace. What began as a moment of humiliation had transformed into an opportunity to educate, to inspire, and to lead by example. He knew that not everyone in that room would change overnight, but seeds of understanding had been planted, and that was enough for now. Inside the hall, the conversations continued. Guests shared their own experiences with bias, discussing how they could take this lesson into their personal and professional lives. Mr. Langston announced plans to create a scholarship fund in James's honor, aimed at supporting underrepresented students in the medical field. It was a small but meaningful step toward the systemic change James had spoken about. As James walked away from Sapphire Hall, he reflected on the night's events. The road to equality was long and filled with challenges, but moments like this reminded him why the journey was worth it. Grace, he realized, was not a sign of weakness, but of strength. It was the bridge between ignorance and understanding, between judgment and empathy. With each step, James carried the night's lessons with him, not as a burden, but as a reminder of the power of standing firm in the face of adversity and moving forward with grace.